Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome back to this radio program Jeff Sharlet to talk about his book, The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War. Jeff Sharlet has been covering religion and the far right in this country for more than 2 decades. He's also the author of the award-winning book, The Family, which was adopted into a Netflix documentary series. He also teaches writing at Dartmouth College. Jeff Sharlet, it is a good pleasure, sir, to welcome you back to this program. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Mitch. Good to be with you again.
The Undertow, this new book of yours, it's an account and a collection of your own essays as you traveled the country, sort of described, and one thinks of the heartland of the far right. And when I saw that, when I first got your book, my assumption before I got into it was, okay, so he drove through the South, maybe the Bible Belt, maybe a little of the Midwest, right? And you did do those things, but you also spent considerable time in California. And I found this was really important because people think of California as being this extremely liberal state. Our politics, comparatively to the rest of the country, are pretty liberal. But what I think a lot of people don't understand is that outside of the bubbles of the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm joining you from, or Los Angeles, which are big population areas, so that explains our politics, but very small geographically, considering the entire state. Once you get outside of these two bubbles, the California becomes much more like the rest of the country.
Yeah. And I think, I live in Vermont, which has 600,000 people. And so while the far right in California is not electorally strong, it is nationally, politically strong. It's 10 times the size of my entire little blue state population, which, by the way, is not so solid blue either. And I think people the problem with that blue state, red state idea is it just distracts you, not from some wonderful purple we all get along, but the fact that these fault lines are everywhere. And so for me, this story, The Undertow, begins in Sacramento. When I'm home in Vermont watching the January 6th insurrection in 2021. And on that day, a woman from Southern California, down by the beach in Southern California, named Ashley Babbitt, 35-year-old Air Force veteran, climbing through a broken window in the Capitol, leading the charge, and was shot. The Capitol police officer who shot her was a black man. She was a white woman. As soon as I saw that, I understood what that American story was going to be. It's an old American story, the lynching story, innocent white womanhood killed by a black predator. And that is indeed what the right, implicitly or explicitly, Tucker Carlson won't use that explicit language, but the people feeding him will, and then he'll translate that. So I knew that was going to be a story. And because she was a Californian, her mother, who felt she'd been unjustly killed, was seeking justice, and they had a rally in Sacramento. So I flew across the country to Sacramento, California. That's where I started the story, outside the Capitol, at a rally for Ashley Babbitt, which, is such an openly white supremacist rally that there's a point in which Ashley's mother says white people should be proud. But let me complicate this for you, because the crowd of Ashley Babbitt supporters is about half people of color. And this is how that white supremacy works. It's what my friend Anthea Butler, a great historian of religion and the Black church, calls in her book, White Evangelical Racism, the Promise of Whiteness. And that was drawing people in. Same is true in Yuba City, California, where I traveled from Sacramento to a church called the Church of Glad Tidings, which has become a kind of a prominent right-wing church. Some people may have seen it. There was a little viral video of General Michael Flynn, Trump's first national security advisor, at the church being gifted an AR-15 up at the altar, an AR-15, which he joked about taking to Washington. This was all part of California. And in fact, actually at that church, which had its own militia, the California militia, they said, oh, we can give you a list of churches. You can just stay in California. You don't have to drive across the country. You can track down the state through militia churches. That's not to speak of North, or as they call it, the Free State of Jefferson, I'm sure listeners out there know about that secessionist movement. So yeah, I think that's really important that we look at California, and we look at all the blue states, and we understand that this fascist moment isn't limited to a couple backwoods pockets.
You're not a historical anomaly. I mean, it could be argued that the modern day conservative movement came out of California.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Orange County is something that sort of transformed that. Of course, Orange County now is fascinating because what I was interested, although it's there in California, there is also this sort of centrifuging. I did end up driving. I didn't stay in California. I drove across the country. I met a young family and they're like, oh, we're leaving California. In Nevada, I met a lot of refugees from California, folks from Orange County, the old conservatives from Orange County, moving to Idaho. So there is a sort of a separating out that's taking place and a kind of a turning inwards. It's the opposite of manifest destiny, this expansion. Instead, it's a kind of curdling, as people abandon any hope, the right especially, of coexisting with the rest of us, and instead seek a mythical purity.
Many months ago, we talked to a political scientist who talked about this very phenomena of Californians leaving California, and where they go, they're actually radicalizing and making more farther to the right the areas they're going to. Was that your experience?
I think that's true when you have this sort of concentration of folks. I mean, but that's true. Look, that's true everywhere. I live in Vermont. There's just one little note in a book about a neighbor of mine called Nazi Ralph. And I call him Nazi Ralph because he has a swastika tattooed on his hand and on his side. And he moved up to Vermont from Massachusetts because it's the whitest state in the Union. And he became part of the Vermont Ku Klux Klan. Some listeners may know there's a Saturday Night Live skit about Klansmen moving to Vermont because it's so white. It's true. SNL didn't know how true it was. And his little corner around Killington, the Killington ski resort, people drive by and they see it so quaint. They don't realize it's a whole community of doomsday preppers, far-right extremists, lots and lots of guns. That is what happens. And then that feeds, it's a little bit like going down the rabbit hole online, following QAnon, but happening in real life. That's what happens at the rallies. That's what happens on January 6th. It's what happens on the internet forums. And I see it happening physically as well.
I want to come back to Ashley Babbitt because I think her story is an important one. And you give it several chapters in your book, her story, and then sort of how she has become a martyr. You also go into great detail in describing what happened on January 6th from what we saw from the videotape. So you watched that closely. I remember at the time when it happened, and these things are always complicated, but I remember watching that at the time, wondering, and even thinking, and I even said on social media, I'm not sure she had to die right there.
No, I don't. I mean, and that's an interesting thing. I was fascinated by the way in which, every time I give an interview and I talk about Ashley Babbitt, someone comes onto my Twitter and says something ranging from, well, she deserved to die, to some really foul, profane, misogynist stuff. And, I'm not crazy about cops killing people. I talked to a man named Seth Stoughton, former police officer, the guy who literally wrote the book on the use of police force. This does not make him some kind of right winger. In fact, he was a star witness in the prosecution of Derek Chauvin. He was the guy who said, let me show you, walk you through step by step why this was murder. He studied, and there's more than one video. There's many, many videos, some never sort of widely seen. And I spent a lot of time studying them all and every witness account, every affidavit. And he said, yeah, this is maybe not a righteous killing. Yes, she was a threat, but police officers are not allowed just to shoot anybody who is a threat. He shot, as he acknowledges, based on a misperception. He had been wrongly informed that shots had already been fired. But here's the irony. The right wingers calling for accountability for that police officer, they could have had it if they had passed the George Floyd Policing Act, which would have, right now, the law as written makes it incredibly difficult to prosecute cops. All they have to do is say, I thought my life was in danger. How do you disprove that? They don't have to be right that their life was in danger. They just have to think it. The George Floyd Policing Reform Act would have changed that. But it was the very right wingers who are coming out day after day. Representative Kevin McCarthy, another Californian, just met with Ashley's mother, saying, where is there justice for Ashley Babbitt? They're the ones who ensured that she wouldn't get it. Ashley Babbitt, I want to be clear. Ashley Babbitt was a terrorist. She was not unarmed. The cover of my book is, in fact, the knife she was carrying into the Capitol.
It was in her pocket?
Yeah, it was in her pocket. It's interesting to see. It doesn't stop Tucker Carlson from night after night because she's become a martyr. It doesn't matter who she was or what she did. She needs to be a story. Trump speaks often of poor Ashley Babbitt being shot in the head. She was shot in the shoulder, but the story works better for him if she was shot in the head. He says, we don't know who killed her. We do. Lieutenant Michael Byrd. He's been on 60 Minutes. But the story works better if he can invoke this deep state keeping secrets. It makes it almost sort of mythical. It makes it a kind of a fairy tale, a martyr story. And there's people out there I know listening saying, Ashley Babbitt's not a martyr. I ask those people to say, we don't get to decide who other movements' martyrs are. Ashley Babbitt died as a witness for her cause. That her cause was false, verifiably false, doesn't change the fact that in her movement, she functions very much like a martyr.
Complicated person, too, she was. I mean, you do get into her biography some. She voted for Obama.
Voted for Obama twice, was her second favorite president. Grew up Southern California, had a reputation as someone who stood up. She was a small person, but feisty, joined the Air Force at 17, served in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of people talked about the fact that she did not make it far in her 14 years of service. But from what I could tell, that was actually because she was the one who was willing to speak back to, the little tyrants who are in every workplace. In the military, that doesn't work very well. And somewhere she turned. And there's a lot of people like that. There's another woman that I write about in a chapter called TikTok, another Democrat, Austin, Texas, hipster. Consumed by QAnon. She doesn't become famous like Ashley Babbitt because all she does is take her car and ram it into other cars trying to kill people she thinks are abducting children. Didn't make national news, barely made local news. Ashley's not that unusual. Evelyn's not that unusual. Folks who are coming to this world not from the traditional right-wing feeders, although they're there too, that are coming through what they call the rabbit holes, whether it's of QAnon or another conspiracy theory. And what you have when you have a fascist social movement, any social movement, it's not monolithic. It's when a lot of different movements, a lot of different people who normally wouldn't be talking to one another start converging. Ashley Babbitt, who's no churchgoer, and the pastor from Oklahoma who holds up his phone right after she's killed on January 6th and says, a 16-year-old girl, an innocent little girl, she's 35, killed by this. Those are people who weren't going to meet in everyday life, but they converge. And I think that's the complexity of Ashley. And I wanted to dig into that because I think people want to sort of lean on this. It's very comforting, right? If we just think, oh, those fascists, it's just a bunch of knucklehead guys in big trucks and, and Oklahoma or fill in the blank of the state that you think isn't human. When we monster the other, we say it's not our problem in a way. We say we're not like that, but we are in the undertow with them, the undertow that is pulling us out to sea, right? What happened to Ashley, I like to think it couldn't happen to me, but it's happened to people like me. It's happened to people that you know. I even there in Oakland, I would guarantee you almost all your listeners, they may not know it, but they have friends who have subscribed to some of the QAnon ideas. It's a really powerful myth, and it's sweeping people away right now.
You have a quote in your chapter about Ashley Babbitt that I felt kind of gets to the heart of what we're experiencing right now and even sort of this divide in the country, and it's this. You write this, quote, #SayHerName. The Patriots will tweet, delighting in their twisting of a campaign created for black women killed by police. It's grotesque, but the dead are the dead, no matter what they died doing. So her name, Ashley Babbitt. In fact, I as a writer, I appreciated how you finally, because you tell her story before you give her name, and that's when you finally do give her name. But this whole, when they started using the hashtag say her name, when I say I feel like this gets to the heart of some of the issues, is they feel as though as a white woman, she is not given the same, I guess, respect or public outcry or advocacy as others get. And I think this is something we find among the right a lot, in which we see movements for social justice. They see these as not pertaining to white people, that there is a double standard.
Yeah, it's sort of the sort of white grievance and white justification that takes. If I could read a passage here, maybe this helps, because at that rally for Ashley Babbitt, a number of speakers invoked Martin Luther King. And if that's surprising to people, they should know that the right's been doing that for a long time. What's new, in my experience, is right wingers invoking Malcolm X, and saying they are in the tradition of Malcolm X, that they are the Malcolms and the Martins. And one speaker here does this, and I said, to a colorblind crowd, and I'm using colorblind in quotes, this is how they conceive themselves, right? The implicit equation was one of themselves with the formerly enslaved. Black becomes white. White becomes the oppressed. Just as white people took the land from indigenous people and then named themselves their victims, so too has whiteness always been a means of claiming the suffering it inflicts on others as its own. White grievance, white justification, the nation not so much fallen as falling, forever in peril, forever in need of redemption, right? And I think that's important. There are open white supremacists on the right. They were at that rally, Proud Boys, with leather studded gloves, and the rally became a brawl between them and Antifa.
Because there was a counter, not a counter demonstration, I guess, but there was a separate demonstration the same day, marking the anniversary of the death.
It would have been Breonna Taylor's 28th birthday on the other side of the Capitol. There was kind of a lovely sort of celebration for that, and then a group, and I'm not using Antifa in any Fox News way. This is how they described themselves to me, came marching around. And, I think what's interesting, I'm an all hands on deck guy when it comes to fascism. I think the threat is monumental and existential. And I'm not a tactician. I'm a writer. So people have different ideas about how to do it, right? This group of Antifa's idea of how to do it was to fight in the streets. And it was clear that those Proud Boys and those Antifa knew each other, had fought before. Some of them recognized each other. And it had a very staged quality to it, right? And there were some ugly elements too of one Antifa woman holding up a sign saying she should have followed the law. Now, I'm sorry, with me, if your response to any police killing is, well, you just should have followed the law, that's not it.
A little surprising to see that from an Antifa.
Yeah, well, also trying to provoke the Proud Boys into fighting, so screaming at them, I don't like to use this language, but the word faggot. And they fought. And I think that's part of, when I think of the slow civil war of the title, and I think we're in it. People say, will there be violence? What do you mean, will there? Will there be violence? There's violence all the time. There's the violence of women now and people and pregnant people who are dying for want of reproductive care. There's all the trans kids who are now being criminalized in 20 states now. And then there's these Oath Keepers and Proud Boys and 3%ers and more, the men with guns who show up outside of drag queen story hours and libraries, schools, hospitals. And increasingly and understandably, there's folks on the left who say, well, if these guys are going to come with guns, we're going to have guns too. Sooner or later, if you line up 2 rows of people with guns, sooner or later, some shooting's going to happen. And I'd say that we're in the standoff zone right now. And it's terrifying. We're in a slow civil war. It could get worse. I don't think it's inevitable, but we have to acknowledge how deep in we are.
You didn't talk about a civil war before, and you didn't talk much about fascism before, even though you've covered the far right in this country for a long time.
Yeah, I think we talked years ago about a book of mine called The Family, which is about the oldest religious conservative organization in the United States going back to 1935, founded by businessmen as a sort of anti-New Deal coalition, anti-labor coalition. They run the annual National Prayer Breakfast, and they recruit elites. Mike Pence, for instance, is a member. Um, and um, and in that book, I had a chapter called The F Word. And the F word is fascism. And this was a group that actually recruited former Nazi war criminals after World War II and had them advising conservative U.S. politicians. Um, and yet they were not fascist. And here's why they weren't fascist, because fascism means something. There's more than one kind of bad under the sun. And this, again, is what I call to leftists and progressives. We need to get smarter about this. There's more than one kind of bad under the sun. But I thought, well, it's not fascism. I even said I didn't think fascism would come to America for this reason, because of fundamentalism. And it's in the book. I have a section where I say, I was wrong. I thought they would never switch out the Father, the God, for a Fuhrer. They would never give up Jesus for an actual real world cult of personality. I was wrong. They did. I thought, too, that the American way of state violence is it's always been a violent country and always declaring itself, the city on a hill. Reagan was a terribly violent president, but that's not what he led with. That's not what he said he was doing. Now we have stepped over into the open and explicit fetish for violence. Violence as regeneration, violence as creating character, violence as pleasure. These are the constituent parts of fascism, as historians like Robert Paxton and scholars like Jason Stanley are looking at fascist development. So I do think that we switched over. And I think the Civil War started when I started traveling after January 6th, traveling around the country. And what actually kind of set me on the road was a survey of historians, scholarly historians, who said, we're closer to civil war than we've ever been. And my wife's an academic historian. I know that historians understand time moves slowly. It really does. In our lives, it always feels like things are changing quickly. They don't.
And we'll even look back on our time differently than the way we see it now.
Yeah, exactly. So for cautious historians to saying, yeah, this is actually on the table. And the very political scientists, some of whom in the past had said, oh, Sharlet, you make too much of the threat of the Christian right, are now saying, yes, this is the real problem. So I went out and I talked to people, and I would say Civil War. I soon discovered that I didn't even have to frame it as a question. I would just say Civil War. And folks would say, yes. And the variation was, did they look forward to it, or did they see it as a sad inevitability? Whether that's real or not, it's a story that's right now that's very powerful, that has a hold of people. It's a story that Trump is telling. It's a story that Ron DeSantis is invoking. And there are casualties already, as I say.
This is Letters on Politics. We are in conversation with Jeff Sharlet. Jeff Sharlet is the author of the book, The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War. I want to come back to something you just said concerning how you never thought that the fundamentalist would replace a person or replace God with an actual person. This, I think we're talking about Donald Trump. To me, it's fascinating, and you write about this, how they see Donald Trump, maybe metaphorically, maybe figuratively, as Cyrus the Great. Yeah, Cyrus was sort of the first king of Persia in the ancient world, who's talked of well in the Hebrew Bible because of his actions towards the Jews, even though he wasn't Jewish himself.
Friend of the Jews. He was a Gentile, and I think there's something that I was sort of prepared from my long research and reporting on the right to understand. That this idea that Christian nationals can only support pious candidates, that's not true anywhere in the world. The National Prayer Breakfast folks have uh, they'll work with anybody. They said, we work with power when we can, build new power where we can't. Some of their clients, one of their most infamous clients was the Indonesian genocidaire, Suharto, who was a Muslim. But he was willing to cut deals in return for American military support. Mike Pence arranged a big arms buildup for Sri Lanka, also not a Christian nation, but it's working with their idea of empire. So I knew that they could do that, but they had not done that in the United States before. And, when I speak of the undertow, I'm always interested in the way the ideas, there is a kind of trickle down fundamentalism. It's true in intellectual movements too. Ideas start one place and then sort of spread out to the masses. And then when they get there, the elites who created those ideas discover, oh, I don't own that anymore. I think that's very much happened with the Christian right, that slowly sort of broke down the resistance to, let's just find a man who can gain power. God's chaos candidate, as a Christian right bestseller called Trump in 2016, a wrecking ball. We know he's not pious, but that's what God wants now. He wants a weapon. It's come not to bring peace, but the sword, as Jesus does say in the Gospels.
He's become a vessel.
Sorry?
Trump has become a vessel.
A vessel, yes, exactly. I think that's, of course, a kind of sophistication about power and movement building. If we look at the sophistication with which the right waged its 50-year campaign against Roe, working with politicians whose views they didn't share, step by step, incrementally doing this, I think they were able to do it. And so I follow a religious current through the book. I've always been writing about religion, from a kind of banal celebrity church in Miami called VU Church, beautiful people, Kanye West and Justin Bieber's pastor, in a prosperity gospel church, through to the religiosity of Trump. And you could see it transforming in real time, because in those crowds, and I first started covering it in 2016, in those crowds, most people don't go to church. They're not actually churchgoers. I'd seen this reporting in Russia. I reported in Russia in 2013 in the beginning of Putin's anti-LGBT campaign, when he said, like, here's how I'm going to solidify power. Putin doesn't care about these issues at all himself. He just knew that this was a good enemy within. He invoked the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Russian people loved it. They don't go to church. I mean, the numbers are in like the single digits, percentage-wise, but they love the idea of the Holy Russian nation. So too, Proud Boys don't go to church. Roger Stone isn't going to church. Trump sure isn't going to church. But that's not what Christian nationalism is really all about.
Jeff Sharlet, a few days ago, we had on this program Bart Ehrman, a religious scholar who has just written a book it's called Armageddon, and it's about Revelation. Yeah. And Revelation, it's pretty mind-blowing. And, he goes through Revelation. He says a literal reading of Revelation, which became kind of a predominant way of evangelicals last couple hundred years, has had real-world consequences. Do you see, when you talk about religion, when you talk to people and when they talk about civil war, do they see this as end time?
Some do. Some see it as the interlude to the great utopian sort of authoritarian world to come. Some experience it as a democratizing force, something like they've never experienced. And I can talk more about that, because they're not entirely wrong about that. There are elements of that. But what Bart talks about is the sort of, I think of it as the concretization of metaphor. You take a metaphor like, for many evangelicals, spiritual war. Spiritual war is a concept that in its roots is much like jihad. Jihad is also not a scary thing. Jihad is someone trying to make themselves a better person, until you start taking the metaphor literally, right? So if you've got war metaphors and you start taking them literally, you end up, as I encountered there in Yuba City, California, a church with its own militia. And I started discovering that there are churches arming up In Omaha, Nebraska, pastor invokes Psalm 23, one of the very gentle ones. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. He points to the men with guns in the back of the church. He says, thy rod is a gun. And one of the gunmen there, in fact, ended up saying, threatening me with a gun. You're going to get out of here. I think that concretization of metaphor is sort of the moment that we're in, and Civil War is that too. We have to remember, for most Americans, unless they grew up in another country, Civil War is just a metaphor. It's a story. And throughout the book, I look at the stories. I mean, Joan Didion famously says, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. I look at the stories they tell themselves. So many of the men with guns, what are they doing? They dream of a Civil War they think is going to be like the movie Red Dawn. They think they're going to be a noble band. I have to say, some on the left have fallen for this too. That's not how the conflict's going to work, but they imagine, they think I'm going to be Patrick Swayze up in the mountains shouting Wolverines, and I'll shoot down the enemy plane with a single bullet. So we've been taught that it will work, but that is a concretization of a metaphor that leads two lines of people with guns facing each other. And sooner or later, it's already happened in a few places, but it hasn't sparked. Someone takes a shot. And the great fear, I think, is not of the militia marching on the Bay Area. That's not going to happen. The great fear, and as a really overlooked piece of opinion journalism recently, was three retired senior generals writing in the Washington Post saying the threat here is that the military is not as unified as people think. And if we get a crisis in the chain of command where commanders do not know who's president, or think they can decide for themselves who's president, now suddenly we're talking about a scale of force that is absolutely terrifying. I don't think we'll get there. I think we can turn back, but that is on the table.
For this job, I do watch a fair amount of conservative media, including Fox media, and they will claim that we're the ones who are actually hyping this idea about a civil war, and that we are the ones who are trying to make them look like they're crazy and out of control and need to be combated. Are we always fair in our assessment?
No, of course not.
As somebody who traveled through the region.
No, of course not. And I mean, even doing interviews for this book, I've talked to journalists living in cities I love, saying like, look, I just think we just have to divide it up. That's also a fantasy that will not and cannot work. You know what? Let's just say we'll go our own way. You can have Georgia, and leaving aside all the people to whom that you abandon to that authoritarian control in those places, or leaving aside. I have a chapter about Wisconsin, which is a majority blue state, so gerrymandered that it has an unbeatable far right state legislature, in which after the fall of Roe became the only blue state to have no abortion, no exceptions. Reverted to 1849 law. Should we abandon them too? Here in Vermont, before the show, we were talking about some of these sort of doomsday preppers up here. So they're stuck with us, I guess. Yes, that fantasy is there on the left. However, the right-wing media saying, "Oh, it's the left hyping this." No, I mean, you and I have been following right-wing media for a long time. The reason I used to discount Civil War is because it did used to be such like a bubbling mess at the fringe of right-wing rhetoric. And then maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I saw it start moving in to more and more respectable circles of the right. And now here it is. We have, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, easy in California to say she's a kook. She is, the second most powerful person in the Republican House. She's
the
talking
second
openly.
Most?
Yes, I think that's fair. I think Kevin McCarthy is still, he is the speaker. She doesn't hold the position
she's not majority
of the second
leader.
most powerful person, but she is effectively. I mean, she's got. Would Kevin McCarthy even be speaker without her support? I don't think so. And she's speaking of a national divorce. So they're just they're not being honest about that. That is language. I've got a stack of books. I collect these self-published right-wing novels that are all Civil War, contemporary Civil War fantasies. I say self-published, it makes it seem like fringe. They sell a lot more copies than I'm ever going to sell of this.
Yeah.
That's a point I make somewhere in the book is that, in fact, I'm talking to a woman named Diane, a QAnon adherent in Sunrise, Florida, a blue part of Florida. And she's telling me that the Las Vegas mass shooter, the man who murdered 59 people at a concert in Las Vegas, remember, was actually part of an Islamist plot to kill Trump. And we know this because there was a man on the same floor who had been seen eating Turkish kebab. It's so ridiculous. Like, oh God, I remember when I talked to her and I'm listening to my recording of our conversation, I'm like, I can't use this. It's too nutty. The same ideas show up on Tucker Carlson from a congressman who's a former general, right? And that's not fringe. You and I right here, we're the fringe. Tucker Carlson has a platform bigger than all left media combined.
The number one platform in the country.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's what's so hard for many progressive and left people to understand. We still think that somehow, even the lefties who don't want to be the center, still think that we're the center of things. We're not. These ideas that we're talking about, that's the fringe. We're the ones who are going to have to come with the imaginative power to take back some ground.
I do try to check myself when we talk about these things because, as you said earlier, we all know folks who at the very least have sympathies for the far right, that we characterize as far right. And when I think of these folks, I'm like, well, they're not terrible people. No. They're not Nazis. They're not Klan members. Are they? They don't think they're racist. I might think they have some racist issues, but they'll tell you. I mean, there was a time where it's like people were very proud to be racist. They would straight up tell you they don't think they're racist, and so sometimes I do try to check myself. Like, okay, what is our role in this dynamic as well?
I don't subscribe to that. I think we are. The book is organized around these sort of three songs. Deo by Harry Belafonte, and we'll talk about the sort of why I bookend it with this seemingly silly novelty song. The middle is Dream On by Aerosmith, heavy rotation at Trump rallies, and it's sort of a way of thinking about vanity. And the last one is Goodnight Irene, which is a lullaby, but is actually an elegy. But there's another old labor song, Which Side Are You On? By Florence Reese in the 1930s, Bloody Harlan, the striking miners, back when miners were on the left, right? And there are moments when you get to a which side are you on situation. And I think the right has forced that, right? I don't like to think in terms of sides. But as a parent of a queer trans kid, it's a which side are you on moment. There's an are you standing over here with the men with guns? Or are you saying no, right? You can't be like, well, I'm really kind of in the middle. I can't make someone show up with guns. You can't provoke someone to hit you. No one made. So one of the defenses a lot of the insurrectionists use, and I've read all their affidavits and ways, it's like, well, I was made to do this strange passive voice. The police open the door. Well, and then you walk through, right? We can't make you commit violence. People choose violence. And I think that's where the metaphor, the undertow, becomes useful, because for so many of these people, like Ashley, Obama voter, not a right-wing person, there's this sense that I think she had that all her life she was struggling to be what she thought of as a good person and a decent person. And she didn't want to be racist. Absolutely correct. She didn't think of herself as that. And she didn't want to be cruel. And Trump came along and said, you don't have to look at me. Look how powerful and rich I am. I didn't do this by trying to be a better person. Let Trump be Trump, as the saying went. And it's like they just fall back into the undertow. I've been trying to be decent. There's an embrace of misogyny. I think of this. I have a former student here a lovely guy, and a full. I think fascist is very much the right term now. How did he get there? He got there by paying attention to U.S. imperialism in Yemen. Bernie Sanders, um, and that got him thinking about things. Then he moved over in COVID to anti-vax politics, and that started carrying him rightward. And then he falls down the rabbit hole, and now there's not an aspect of it that he does not believe. He's a sommelier, still a lovely guy. If you met him in a restaurant, he recommended wines to you. You'd think, what a charming, thoughtful, literate guy. Um, uh, and he believes in holy war. Those two things we have to understand coexist. But nobody made him go there. I don't think we can look. You can look at American imperialism in Yemen. That didn't. You don't to critique that. You don't have to become a fascist, right? We can look at in the book. There's a chapter I'm looking at the role of misogyny and all this, and the men's rights movement, which is the nastiest movement I've ever written about. And they love to talk about
some pretty nasty things.
And they are the worst. They're not the most powerful, but they are the worst. Every right-wing movement I've ever gone to, it's part of what's interesting is that they're always more fascinating, more complex than their caricature, except these guys. And their caricature is dumb, and they are actually dumber. They have all these real issues: suicide in men, and incarceration, and labor, and mental health, and custody. And instead, they sit around and they talk about their ex-wives, their ex-girlfriends, the girlfriends they never had, the girlfriends they had a right to, like in California, the so-called supreme gentleman, Elliot Rodger, a hero to some, who went on a killing spree because he was denied the girlfriend he thought he had a right to. And he would say, and they would say all the time, I was provoked. It wasn't. I met, in fact, one man, a so-called age of consent activist. These are men who think it is terribly unfair that they're not allowed to pursue their pedophilia. These are the same guys calling Joe Biden a pedophile. Age of consent, this man says, should be 12. He's a registered sex offender, and he was wearing a T-shirt that said "free." I'm not going to say the man's name. Another man is serving 10 years. What happened? It wasn't his fault. He groomed a young woman. She sent him naked pictures. What was he supposed to do? Of course he had to act. You can't make someone cross that horrific line. I think you wear a short skirt in an alley, you're not inviting anything. I'm on a college campus, and where some of that rhetoric still exists, someone gets sexually assaulted. Well, what were you wearing? What were you drinking? You can't make someone attack you. Right now, the right is intensely attacking a lot of vulnerable folks. And whereas we can talk about tactical errors, strategic errors, things I disagree with, and the Democratic Party easily all day long, nobody made them do this.
Imperialism is an interesting issue right now that you mentioned, in this case, concerning this man in Yemen. It does seem imperialism and just a hatred towards the establishment itself has united elements of the right and left. Well,
are they still left? I think of it as, the journalist Matt Taibbi, the Taibbi slide, where, or the Glenn Greenwald, I don't know what to call what he's done, right? It's a well-trodden path. Christopher Hitchens took it before that, although on behalf of Empire in War. You see something in a right-wing critique which has substance, and there are right-wing critiques, or you see the isolationism of the right, and you don't look too closely, because Trump didn't fight less war. He fought more. There is a rhetoric.
He didn't create a war, though. He didn't start a war.
Sorry?
He didn't start a war.
No, he didn't start a war. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I mean, to me, this is like the folks who get caught up into debates about who's worse, Hitler or Stalin. After the first million, I tend to think that we're in territory where we're talking about about real evil. And I think this is true here, right? You can look at the American establishment, the way the Democratic Party does not offer an anti-war politics. So that in Trumpist movements, I found any number of Iraq veterans who were bitter and would speak a language that sounded left, blood for oil. Their diagnosis is correct. They were sent to bleed for oil. I agree with that 100%. I was out in the streets. My very first protest arrest was in the first Iraq war. That shaped my whole political life. That doesn't mean that their prescription is correct, that the solution is the strong man, that the solution is an interlocking network of strong men. The isolationism of the Trump movement, of Trumpism, that sees that says, hey, let's not build up to a giant war in Ukraine. This is not peace loving. Trump has always been, he was clear about that in 2016. He thinks like a gangster. The movement thinks like a gangster. I own this piece. That's Putin territory. It's like, that's Genovese, that's his borough of New York or whatever. This is a division of the world between strong men. It is not democratic. There is no common cause with fascism. There can be some common cause against fascism. And we have precedents of that in U.S. history. We have the Popular Front, which fought fascism in the 1930s, communists and Democrats. We have the example of the Weimar Republic, where the left and the liberals would not work together. And we saw who won. But I guess at this point, I think having been in these places long enough, I think those corners of the left that say there's no difference between Biden and Trump, that is a profound naivete. And that's no defense of Biden. There's a difference between, slowly inching toward the cliff and hitting the gas and driving over it.
Jeff, Sharlet, as we move to wrap up here, you mentioned that you are the father of a queer child, and this is not to get you to talk any more about your child than you want to, but the transphobia of late has been intense, especially intense before this occurred, but after the school shooting in Nashville, watching Fox News again, and they constantly refer to the killer as the trans killer.
Right. 90 school shootings so far this year, one by a trans person. The other 89, I look forward to Fox's crackdown on cis het people who are mostly responsible for the other 89. I don't really look forward to this, of course. This is a banal way of thinking. It is not a category that explains. But you're right. Last night, I tuned into this stuff. I followed pretty closely. And last night, Tucker Carlson took a huge step, said trans people are the enemy of Christendom. Now we are in holy war rhetoric. I think, and this is, that murderer in Nashville, cursed be their name. I have no interest. I've also seen some rhetoric of saying, well, they suffered and so on. Many suffer. We don't pass on the pain, and those who kill, I don't need them. But yeah, it is a terrifying turn. It is the front line right now, this slow civil war. It's calling for us all to pay attention. I am willing to talk about my kid, and they've given me permission to do so. Because I've been writing about this for 20 years. I vowed not to write about this stuff anymore, but I'm frightened for my child. And they want me to do something. Well, this is what I know how to do, is to go around and report and talk to everyday people and find out what's going on, and to try and map this menace so that we can find a way through it.
Jeff Sharlet has been our guest. Again, he has joined us for a conversation about his book. It's called The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War. Jeff Sharlet, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thanks so much, Mitch.